This conference will now be recorded.
Well, Megan was online. All right, well, I'll just get us started, and then if Megan jumps on, she could say a few words. But Megan and I are the co-chairs of the Open Science Subcommittee. So welcome everyone to our second meeting of this year. So we have 4 a year, one each quarter. And we have a really exciting schedule today. I believe I'm sharing the schedule right now. We've got Curtis Boland, director of the Casco Bay Partnership, and then Michael Meyer, who is a newly minted employee of USGS. And I think their talks are going to be really exciting today. Before we get started on that, I, of course, always have updates that I like to share with everybody of what is going on with open science in the Tampa Bay region, and also some various things that might be of interest to this group. For those of you that don't know, I've actually been on parental leave for the last 3 months, and I'm hesitant to share this, that I will be back full-time on the 9th, so feel free to contact me and start working with me again after that time. But understandably, I haven't done a whole lot in the last 3 months work-wise, but I do still have some updates that I think will be of interest to this group. So I've actually dredged up a few things that have happened since the time I've been off. So I will share them with you at this time. So I'll spend maybe about 5 or 10 minutes with some updates, and then we'll get into our speakers for today. And I also wanted to mention too that we do have a discussion at the end that will be facilitated by Greg Blanchard. So I've got some slides that will cue up that discussion when we get there. All right. So Open Science Subcommittee, roles and responsibilities. I always start with this just to remind everybody what this group is about. Again, I don't want to go through this in super details because I think that we're all familiar at this point, but I still think it's good to go over what we're trying to do as a group and develop this community of practice within our region. I see our group as having 3 main goals: support the development of open science products at TVEP and among our partners; 2, rank priority research areas for developing open science products; and 3, facilitate training activities. So that's what we try to do. We have a guiding document here that sort of lays down these roles and responsibilities in more detail. So if you are forgetting what we're trying to do as a group, definitely check that out to remind yourself about where we're trying to go with this subcommittee. In terms of updates, a couple things I just wanted to mention very briefly. Oh, hi, Megan. So I actually, at the last TAC meeting in January, that actually happened prior to our last subcommittee meeting, we presented on an R Sparrow model. That was actually a project that we've been working on at TVEP here for actually a couple years now, but it's a project that's primarily funded through USGS and NOAA. If you're familiar with watershed modeling, Sparrow has been a tool that has been in use for many decades now, and we've been delighted to know that they're actually taking efforts, great efforts, mind you, to make the source code of Sparrow more open source. So there's this R Sparrow model out there now that is actually working on converting the old SAS code to R, which is great because now it's all open source. You don't need a license. And on top of that, they're actually developing some decision support tools on top of that. So if you're familiar with R Shiny, that's something we use here at TBEP to create dashboards. They're actually building a decision support tool with Shiny to actually help deliver the results of the Sparrow models in a more accessible format. So we are actually fortunate at the Estuary program here to be one of the end user groups for this project. So this is a national scale product, but they've been working with some of us here in Tampa Bay, as well as the Sarasota Bay Estuary program. Mobile Bay is another end user group, and then Winyah Bay up in North Carolina, I believe, is another one of the end user groups. So we are the direct recipient of the calibrated models, the newly updated R Sparrow tools that have been calibrated for our specific watershed. So we have, I think, a phosphorus watershed model, and then a nitrogen watershed model will be forthcoming soon. So just want to make this group aware of the tools that are out there. Check out the presentation link to learn more about what this project is all about. But I think it's pretty exciting and definitely something that I think has interested this group, especially because it's now an open source platform that we can readily use. Also, I've been saying in past meetings that we've been basically making all of our efforts for working with the Piney Point data sets open. So I've given updates in the past about some of the products around those efforts, but I'm happy to announce that our paper that we previously just had available as a preprint is now available on the journal Marine Pollution Bulletin. So it is now been peer reviewed. It's a bona fide paper in the primary literature. So that's out there. It's great. It actually was published 1 year to the day that the discharge started at Piney Point, which was kind of a fortunate coincidence, but it's out there. It's been getting great press. It's open access paper, and we think that this is, I think, a step forward in terms of describing what has happened last year with Piney Point and getting out there to the broader scientific community and sort of starting a conversation around how do we really prevent this from happening again. So that's out there. And then I think my last update is about the Joint Aquatic Sciences meeting. I talked about this last meeting, but I just want to remind everybody that this meeting is actually happening in just over a week now. It will start on May 14th. It will be an in-person meeting, but it does have a virtual option for registration. And if you've never been to a JASM meeting before, they're quite large. It's a meeting that brings together multiple different professional societies and in one great space to have good conversations around aquatic sciences. But myself, as well as Alex Huddell, who talked at our last meeting, James Ammerman and James Hagee, we have actually convened a special session on open science for collaborative management of aquatic ecosystems. And that is going to be going down on May 16th on that Monday from 1:30 to 5. Actually, Michael, who is speaking today, is giving a practice presentation. He's giving one of the keynotes at that session. So if you are going to that meeting, definitely check out our session. I think it is relevant to this group. I'm not sure if the talks will be available after the fact, but if they are, I'll make them available to this group as well. Yeah, so this is the lineup for the session on that Monday. So we'll have 2 sessions. First one will be 4 talks. Michael will be kicking that off, giving a 30-minute talk, and then the second one will be later that afternoon. We actually have Anna Holder from the California State Water Boards talking about all the great work that's been done in their neck of the woods of California in terms of delivering open science and opening data and speaking to the equity issues as well in California. So definitely check that out. And like I said, I don't have a lot of announcements today since I've been on leave. But before we get into our speakers, are there any questions about any of those announcements or anything like that before we move on? See that Mike put the JASM link in the chat there if you want to check that out. So thank you, Mike. All right. So we will move on to our first speaker. So we've got Curtis Bullen, Director of the Casco Bay Partnership. And can you share your screen, Curtis?
If I can figure out how to get the right screen, that's the.
All right.
I'm Okay, see if that does it.
That looks good. So,
Okay, so good, I got it. Okay, and I can see what you're
awesome.
seeing. Great.
Right. Yeah. So just a little introduction to Curtis here. So Curtis is the director of one of the NEPs, Casco Bays, and he'll tell you all about this. I don't want to steal too much of his thunder, but every 3 years, every NEP has to create a State of the Bay report, and I saw the recent State of the Bay that they put out. And there's a lot of great open science use in there, a lot of good resources available. And I invited Curtis to just talk about his experience doing that, and things that were useful, things that weren't useful, and how do you do open science in practice. I think this is a great example of that done in the real world. And we at the Estuary program here in Tampa, we are currently working on our State of the Bay now. I actually provided some announcements last meeting of kind of the web presence we have for that. That's sort of a living document that taps into some of the data sets to summarize the things that we care about here in Tampa Bay. And we will have a print version available hopefully in the near future, in the next couple of weeks, that is a continuation of the web presence that uses some of those same tools. So I had a personal interest in hearing about Curtis's experience, because we're kind of going through that now. But obviously, I think this is of interest to this group here because of it's just a demonstration of open science in practice and creating more reproducible and more real-time data products that can support decision making. So hopefully I didn't sort of ruin the punchline there, Curtis, but feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you. And I want to say I had the great pleasure of being down in Tampa Bay for the science meetings this spring. And part of what I'm going to talk about is reflecting how different things are for us versus you guys. But it was really a treat to be down there and to meet some of you. So it was nice to get down there and learn a bit about what's going on in Florida. As Marcus said, what I want to do is I want to talk about our experience trying to move towards an open science concept for our State of the Bay report. And I want to start with a little bit of introduction to who we are, because I think the context really matters in terms of understanding our experience here. So if I can get the slide progressed. There we go. We are, as Marcus said, one of the 28 National Estuary programs, and like all of the National Estuary programs, we have sort of the common DNA of really focusing on watersheds, really trying as an organization to stay science focused. We have no regulatory role, and the sort of the glue of the National Estuary programs is to figure out how to be as collaborative as possible, and that works within the State of the Bay context as well. Our particular management plan, what we call the Casco Bay plan, has got 4 focus areas, and this shouldn't be a surprise to people who are familiar with National Estuary programs in general. We've got a section on habitat, a section on water quality, especially in our case nutrients, and ocean acidification, a section on community resilience, and finally a sort of an umbrella for what we really spend a lot of our time doing, which is communication and coordination. And the State of the Bay process actually falls under this communication and coordination section of our management plan. So a lot of what we were thinking about is how do we communicate and how do we make the results of what we're doing as useful to our community as possible. But we are not much like Tampa Bay Estuary Partnership. We have a staff of 4. We're much smaller. So I am director and lead scientist. I have one person who leads our habitat work. I have one person who works our community engagement work, and an administrative lead. But it's a tiny team, and we have no major research universities nearby. Our nearest research universities are 2 hours north or 2 hours south, for the University of Maine and the University of New Hampshire, respectively. So we do have some local colleges in the area, one of which has got a nice marine lab facility, but in general, there are not a lot of academics working in our area. So most of our partnerships on a lot of this work are with federal and state agencies. And we are, in fact, hosted at one of those universities. We're hosted at the University of Southern Maine as part of what they call the Catherine Cutler Institute. Casco Bay is also really, really different from Tampa. We've got about 160 square miles of water. It's a glaciated landscape, so we have north-south and northeast-southwest trending ridge lines that are glacially scoured. We have 60 feet of marine clays that were deposited when this entire section of the coastline was underwater, and therefore erodible bluffs, very complicated steep shorelines. We've got something on the order of 750 or so islands in Casco Bay. And our tidal range, sort of the average tidal range, is about 10 feet from low to high tide, but our spring tide range is closer to 13 feet. So we've got really, really high tidal exchange in most of our system. Our watershed is very different from what you guys are dealing with in Tampa and Sarasota Bay areas. We're about 1,000 square miles, a little under 1,000 square miles, but 2/3 of that is still forested. We touch on 48 municipalities. Counties in Maine do pretty much nothing. So that means I'd work with 48 local governments, which is entertaining. And those 48 towns represent only about 4.5% of Maine's land area, but contain over a quarter of the jobs and a quarter of the population and a third of all the jobs in the state of Maine. And those 48 towns only have a population of about 350,000 people. The actual watershed, the population is closer to 250,000 people. So it's a small, less developed watershed. Many of our issues are rather different from what you all face. And that context informs a lot of what we did as part of the State of the Bay. Our motivation for going to really thinking about open science goes back to what I think of as our information archaeology project that we completed a couple of years ago. And this is an effort that we did to dig back into our archives and start to digitize all of the paper records from the first 20 years of the National Estuary Program. And it was quite an effort to go back and find all the past reports and digitize them and figure out what to do with them. We scanned them. They are now on our website on a searchable subcomponent of our website, and also on the University Digital Commons page, which is searchable using a variety of online global search mechanisms. So these things are nominally searchable, but there was no mechanism at that point to think about how do we share data from these older reports. And the data, when it is present, is typically in, it's on a PDF, and not only a PDF, but a scanned PDF. So there's basically no way to access that data without retyping it, or at least cleaning up scanned data. So real problems with that. And the other thing we found looking at historical data out of these records is, for the most part, what we had was a report with either no metadata at all or extremely poor metadata. So data sharing was a real challenge for us. We decided then to extend that project into what we thought of as a data archaeology project, where we hunted around through everything and found every conceivable source of data we could find for those old reports. And we were working off of old floppy disks from the old little hard Macintosh floppy disks from the 1980s up through a variety of other formats, and tracked down a huge amount of the underlying data in electronic form for a lot of those reports, which was pretty neat. But again, what we found is, in general, that was a file on a floppy disk. There was no metadata whatsoever except what was in the report. And the data formatting was often poorly laid out for actually thinking about data reuse. And we found we'd lost a fair amount of data because of obsolete data formats, or even because some of the media had deteriorated over time. So this thinking about how are we going to use historical data really motivated us to say, what can we do looking forward to do a better job? We also work with a network of about 25 organizations that we call the Casco Bay Monitoring Network. The little map I'm showing there is a dot map of all the locations where we could document data was collected in Casco Bay as of 2016. A lot of those were one-offs, but the red dots, for example, are annual. 6 samples taken at every one of those locations for bacterial contamination of the waters. So there's a lot of data that's being collected, and most of these partners, though, don't make their data publicly accessible. Online data access is rare for these data sources. And again, generally speaking, when it is available, the metadata is really, really lousy. So, the solution we came up with is really, how do we start moving the entire community towards thinking about open science? And our monitoring network, which meets generally 2 to 4 times a year, has specifically requested that we try to invest in developing some information infrastructure to make data more available to that community of people. And we're just beginning that process in terms of thinking about what that's going to look like and what their real information needs are going to be. All of that has got us to really thinking about there must be a better way. There's got to be something we could do to do this better. And we decided to take a first step there by looking at our State of the Bay process. And we don't actually produce ours every 3 years. We produce ours every 5. And we decided that we really wanted to use this as a test bed for what real open science work would look like for us and how we could share information in a relatively low-cost way with our network of collaborators. And so we started out saying we wanted to make all of our data available. We haven't quite achieved that, but we're pretty close. And we wanted to make all of our data analysis transparent so that people can look over our shoulders and tell us when we've done something stupid. I won't go into detail on what the content of the State of the Bay report is. This is our little pie chart of the 19 different chapters of the State of the Bay report, roughly organized into drivers and stressors, current condition of Casco Bay, and human connections to the bay. And like most of these reports, it tends to be it does grow to be quite a large effort. It took us several years to pull it all together, again, with a staff of 4. So, a lot of us doing a lot of background work. We collected on that work, we worked with about 40 to 45 different data sources, depending on how you count it, sourced from 25 different organizations. So again, we've got this large network that we're trying to figure out how do we move them more towards thinking about making their data publicly visible and publicly accessible. Our vision for the State of the Bay report was that we would have a hierarchical structure, that we'd have a publicly facing document that was the core of what we were producing, but that we wanted to provide several different avenues for people to dig a little deeper to look at underneath the public-facing document. And the first was a supplementary information section that is online, which includes data sources, citations, formal citations, which we did not include in the public-facing document, and then set suggestions for further reading on each of those chapters. But then we also have public access to all of our data and code, or almost all of our data and all of our code. And we have a limited map viewer, which is not quite up and running yet. I've got the URLs on the bottom of that page. This presentation will be available for folks if you want to try to hunt stuff down. So don't try scribbling things down too much. They're not convenient URLs to hunt for. For the most part, we relied on open source tools to do the work. We ran into a few problems with that. We used GitHub as our primary platform for sharing both our analysis and also our data. Not ideal as a data sharing platform for a variety of ways, which I'm happy to talk about later, but it's free and it's relatively easy to learn how to use. About 80% of the analysis we did was conducted in R, and we predominantly did the analysis in R notebooks because that immediately translates into online content, which people can read. We used the tidyverse extensively for those of you who are R geeks, and almost all of our graphics are generated out of the ggplot tools. So, a lot of familiar tools for people who are using R all the time. We did use Python for a few odds and ends. We used it for some data access where the scripting capabilities in R just were a little bit more awkward to use, and I hadn't learned them yet. Now I've learned some of them, and I do it differently now. And the other thing we used Python for was ocean acidification data analysis, because the OA tools are a little bit more up to date in the Python versions than they were in the R tools that we found for ocean acidification analysis. And for us, one of the most important parts of this whole stack of tools is that they were free, while I was working with a lot of other, especially statistical analysis tools, were quite expensive. And this is why I originally started using R about 15 years ago, was because it was a good way to get started doing some pretty sophisticated analysis without large outlays of cash. The one area that we really couldn't do with using open tools was our GIS analysis. And while I know there are GIS tools out there that are available, nobody in our community works with them on a regular basis. And so we went with non-open source tools. We did find that the results of working with ArcGIS were problematic in terms of data sharing because they lean so hard on proprietary data formats. And we're less worried about that short term, but in terms of our long-term data archaeology experience, proprietary data formats go out of style, and that becomes really problematic if you're thinking about having data archives that last for decades. GitHub was the core of what we did for public access. It was really easy to work with once you learned the basic concepts, although I'll talk about barriers to use in a minute. But the core reason we used it is because the online access tools are readily accessible even for people who are not particularly computer savvy. And it generated a place where we could store all of our reusable code. And that's going to dramatically speed up our future state of the Bay processes, because all the code for working right from the raw data we got from our partners up to final graphics is there in a repeatable format. GitHub is almost discoverable in that there are various ways to search on GitHub to find things, but it's not discoverable well. So that's not one of its great strengths. But for our purposes, where we were already giving people a link through our state of the Bay structure, it worked just great. Let me see, I want to try to do a little bit of a side trial here to show you what the structure looks like on the state of the Bay. And I think you can see this is one of our website. This is on our website. It's the State of the Bay website. And what I want to just show is what we've got built on the website now is the public-facing document is available as a PDF, but you can also go through and click on any one of the indicators, and it takes you to a web-based page. And I won't go into the details of what's there, but nicely laid out by our graphic designer. You get to the bottom of each of these, and there's a link to the supplementary information. And that gives us where your further reading is, formal references, things like that. Or you can click on the data repository, and that takes you straight to the GitHub archive for all of the State of the Bay reports. So we've got several different layers built right into the website. We don't expect a lot of people to be going to those locations, but we do think it's an important tool for people to be aware of and seeing how the steps gets put together. A little bit of reflection on what we learned and what we didn't learn, and the challenges we faced as a small shop doing this. The learning curve on using some of the open science tools is really considerable, and not so much a problem for our specialists, but a real problem for working with my colleagues here at the Estuary program who are not data analysts at heart, who have never worked with R, who have seldom worked with Python, and for whom GitHub was a real challenge because of the origins in programming. Without that background in programming language and understanding Unix and Bash scripting concepts and things like that, there's a very steep learning curve for newbies to get started. Many of our partners had the same issue since they have never used some of these tools. We have a certain amount of translation that needs to happen between the way we're now doing the work and the way our partners think about their work. They're beginning to follow what we're doing and shift more towards using these open source tools. And the younger staff at most of the organizations we work with are more familiar with this than the folks who have been doing it for a long time. The other real challenge we faced is that doing this and doing it well was a tremendous amount of extra work, and we really didn't plan for that. And up front, the work was things like defining an archive structure that was going to be consistent and work for all 19 chapters of State of the Bay. We had to develop default graphics design standards, things like colors and fonts and sizes. We actually had to write some R code to create a package that would make sure that our graphics followed those default graphic standards. There's issues about licensing that we had never thought about. How do we license our own GitHub archives? But also, do we need to have data sharing agreements with our partners since their data is now going to be publicly visible? What kind of legal arrangements do they want? What kind of legal arrangements do they care about? It turns out we raised this with all of our data sharing partners, and they were just thrilled to have their data out public. And we have very little legal underpinning for this. People were quite happy to share the information. While we were in the process of developing it, the biggest challenge was the added time involved in really thoroughly documenting all of the analyses so that when they were on that GitHub archive and when I look at it back in another decade, I'll understand what's going on and I can remember all those details. That's good programming practice, but we're all sloppy when we don't have an audience looking over our shoulder. So there's a lot more time involved in putting things together. And then the wrap-up process was exceptionally time-consuming. I did not really realize that with 19 chapters and often 4 or 5 data sources for each one of those and 4 or 5 files doing the analysis of each data source, we're looking at literally hundreds of files that we needed to clean up, revise, spell check, check for typos, post, review, check again, repost. And then we did all of that, and our colleagues from EPA said, that's really great, you've got too much information there. can you strip these down to the really core information that your readers are really going to want to see and make it easier for us to find the core information? So we had to go back and do that all again and clean everything down a second time. It was a very important step. It made the data repositories much more useful, but it was another month and a half of work to clean those things up and get them posted separately. We also ran into challenges with our partners, just because our partners are largely unfamiliar with these open source and open science tools. In general, we don't have a common vision across all of those 25 organizations who are in the monitoring network about how we do data sharing or why we do data sharing. When we do get data from our partners, they're not used to the idea that the person receiving the data isn't familiar with how it was collected. The metadata is usually incomplete. We've begun to talk more and more about what we think of as a data biography, which is talking about how the data came to be and what were the reasons why the data was originally collected. It's not what's usually considered metadata. It's more about the narrative behind it. All of those things affect how you ought to do appropriate data analysis, and our partners are not used to doing that yet. And that's been a real challenge to train people to think about that. The other place we tripped over challenges was with graphic design, because especially the tools coming out of R generate graphic styles that really reflect the R tools, even with a fair amount of hand management of cleaning things up. And that required us to redraw a lot of graphics that people were sending us that were done in other data formats, like things coming out of Excel. We needed to load into R just to create graphics that matched our graphic styles. And then spitting out those file formats and sharing them with a graphics designer. Not all of the graphics formats that R likes to put out are readily edited in secondary graphics design software. And our graphics designers, we had to go back and forth a number of times cleaning up those file formats and making so that they could work with the data that we produced out of R in a productive and useful way. And as I said earlier, GIS was a consistent problem. It's figuring out how to get GIS and get cartography information shared, because those data formats are just big and nasty and complicated. So what I walked away from really being pleased about this, I think it was a great success overall. I'm really pleased at how this works on our website. I'm really pleased about where we are in terms of just documenting what we've done. Our science is much better documented, and in particular, all of our data quality assurance steps, which used to be done behind the scenes, they're now in code, and people can look and see what we did. Every decision we made about which data, what data to include and what data to exclude is carefully documented in those GitHub archives. This is a kind of transparency that I think is unparalleled in terms of what we've done previously, and I think has been rare historically in these state of the bay kinds of reports. So I really think it's an important step forward. The other thing is we've got this now long-term data accessibility, at least as long as GitHub archives live. This is not the same as putting it on a long-time archive that promises to be there forever. We've explored some of those alternatives, but have not gone there yet. And we have seen secondary use of our data in several classrooms. We've seen it done in both high school and college level, that having the data available and us able to have a conversation with students has been a tremendous help for educators in the region. And we've seen the data picked up and used in one master's thesis project already. So it's nice to see the data getting that secondary use. We've put all that work into putting it out there. So I think overall, we've learned a lot. We've done something which I'm quite proud of for a tiny team to be able to pull this together. And there were, though, a couple of sort of ifs, ands, and buts that I'm concerned about here. What happens when the technology changes? Right now, GitHub is widely understood and widely respected. It's a place where people are going to be able to go to. Is that going to be true in a decade? I'm now on my third State of the Bay report, and every time I do it, something has changed. The tools are different, the data sources are different, and it really, I expect that to be true here as well. I don't know which of these tools are going to evolve and change between now and our next State of the Bay report, but some of them will. I'm concerned that although the data is publicly online, finding it may be a real challenge. Certainly, there's no automated way to search for this data. If you don't know it's there, you probably won't find it, and your web crawling spider bot won't find it. So, that becomes problematic. And then our metadata is now embedded in the R code as sort of explicit and implicit metadata as part of the archive. And that worries me because one of the things I've learned is that nobody pays enough attention to metadata on the back end. We haven't got it in an electronic readable format. We don't have it in a way that people will be able to work with well. So we really need to find a way to transition towards true searchable data and searchable metadata. We haven't gone there yet, but we've got a good start in terms of understanding what the work involved is likely to look like. So my conclusion for that is we have a long way to go, but we're on our way, and I think we've done some cool stuff. So that's it for me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Curtis. I have a lot of thoughts and questions for you, but I wanted to give other folks a chance to chime in first before I monopolize your time.
Hey, Curtis, that was a great talk. Do you mind if I ask a question, Marcus?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, that was a great talk. Several of those themes you touched on really rang with me, different levels of pain. So have you, with respect to, I think you kind of ended with like, how do we make our data searchable? And I think like in my framework, that's like, tapping into those, if you're familiar with FAIR, like findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible. And I guess to what extent have you thought about teaming up with data repositories? So I'm thinking like in particular, like environmental data initiative seems like a great home for your data. But like, as you also said, those repositories might be limited in time. So like there's things like if NSF stops funding those repositories, then your data, what happens? Most of them have backup plans. So I guess like in terms of your metadata documentation, how do you find the best repositories? Have you thought about teaming up or targeting specific ones?
Yeah, we were lucky enough. Matt Liebman, who is our Region 1 administrator for the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, has a great interest in coastal acidification. And he actually helped us find some money to do a project along with Nirakus, our local coastal ocean observing system representative, to actually look at a number of different data repositories, specifically looking at ocean acidification data and potential repositories to use for ocean acidification data. And Nirakus did a pretty neat idea as part of that study, where they actually went to a bunch of our partners and paid them to enter data into the repositories and then interviewed them about the process and what worked and what didn't work. And they used 2 or 3, they looked at about half a dozen different repositories and evaluated them, and then mostly had folks focus on just a couple of the repositories and really focus on what's the experience like. That report, Holly Galavati from EPA is on the verge of releasing that. I saw the page proofs about a month ago. I sent her an email yesterday saying, okay, where the hell is it? Is it done yet? So there will be a report coming out very quickly that sort of focuses on this question of how do you actually do it? Because again, our biggest barrier on this is that we don't own most of the data. And so, this becomes an ownership issue as well as a repository issue. I'm thinking we will head in that direction. Again, one of my concerns about in our experience when we're working with a lot of this data, understanding that data biography, which is different from the metadata doesn't carry the data biography. And the data biography is the weird things like all that data that Maine DEP collected was because they knew there was a problem that year and they wanted to study that site extra hard. Well, that's not in the metadata formally, but if you don't know that when you're analyzing the data, you're going to completely misrepresent what it means. So, there's a lot of challenges that I see to this idea of just putting things into a data repository that I don't think we've quite resolved when we're working with what I think of as borrowed data, which is what our state of the day reports live on, is borrowed data.
Yeah, yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I just want to just a comment of praise. The great work. Thank you for also. I was not familiar with the Casco Bay, so it was excellent for me to check out this and learn a little bit about it. And on top of it, also I've been an evangelist in terms of bringing in more coding to where I'm at now and what I've been. And what you hit a note to me when you said we now know because of code what data sets were included, what assumptions were made, and we can either, turn them on, turn them off as at will. So I was like, that's being, again, trying to be an evangelist for this is what I'm saying. Like, you don't have to guess what I did. It's right here. So thank you very much. Great work.
Thank you for saying that. That was actually one of my original goals in how we structured our archives, is that our data quality management planning for the entire process was hinged on the idea that we wanted to be able to undo every step of the data transformation from the raw data we were handed to the final graphic. And the only way I could think to do that was to put as much as possible of that in code, because that way we've got it all documented, and if you wanted to change something, you could do it. It was a lot more work to do it that way, but it does mean that we've got, there's always weird decisions that you have to make along the way about, I didn't quite understand what was going on, and you're making decisions based on the best available information. I don't know that I did them all right. I think I did them all reasonably, but that's the second piece, is at least now if somebody comes back and says you misunderstood something, hey, we can redo it. And that to me was one of the real goals here, was to be able to document this idea that every data transformation should be undoable, to me, is a core part of our data quality assurance planning.
Yeah, Curtis, you and I think are kindred souls. Your struggles have been the same struggles that I've had in Tampa here. I mean, sort of exposing methods from archived reports, and like you said, not really sure you're doing it right all 100% of the way from data to product, but at least putting it out there in a way that others could inspect it should the need arise, and making the whole workflow transparent and reproducible, I think is one key concept. And a couple things you said too that really resonated with me about just there's so much more to be done. This is just an incremental process towards really achieving true openness. And maybe I'm a pessimist. Yes, I am. I guess I'll say I am. I don't think we'll ever reach 100% true open science and the holy grail of like everyone's using these tools, all of our processes are documented, metadata documentation is there to its full extent, and everybody can find it in a way that 100 years from now they'll know exactly what Curtis did to create State of the Bay report. I don't think we'll ever be there, but what we can do, I think, is motivate people to use the tools and be comfortable with them. And one thing you said that I think maybe addresses this issue is a common complaint I hear about people using open science for the first time is they're afraid about being open. They're afraid about exposing their mistakes. What do you tell people that have that fear of just putting their code online? How do you put that to bed in a sense that makes them comfortable that doing so is the more correct way to do science, in that it's a value for them as scientists or practitioners putting the tools out there in an open space?
I don't actually tell people that. I just do it. And it's more by example than anything else, right? I have pretty much at this point, I do a fair amount of side projects besides State of the Bay. That, for example, I've been doing a lot of work on the state of Maine is developing marine nitrogen criteria right now. And I've been doing secondary reanalysis of a lot of their analysis. Almost always, I put that stuff also up on GitHub. I actually haven't for the nutrient analysis because of it's not official data yet, and they don't want me to post that yet. But when I do those side analyses, or when I assist a lot of graduate students with analyses on things that they haven't done before, all of that goes up on GitHub as well. So what I'm doing is I'm less being a proselytizer and more saying, hey, it's not so scary. And you can always flag things, and I do it regularly, saying, hey, this was a preliminary analysis. And it doesn't. It's more of a cultural shift, I think, than anything else. And I think one of the recognitions is that none of us do. Data analysis has become, in part because of the open source tools, so incredibly diverse and so complicated that none of us can be experts at all the different tools we're picking up. And I think we have to be comfortable with that. We have to get comfortable with the idea that we're necessarily going to do everything right, but we're moving the ball forward. And I think that's more by showing than by explaining.
Yeah, all good points. Lead by doing is, I think, a good take home from this. The other point you made too is that transparency is good because it just gets another set of eyes on your code. And I can count dozens of instances in the last 15 years since I've been doing this work of somebody finding my mistakes, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
Right, exactly.
You want to correct the issues, and if you're doing things in secret, they'll never be exposed. So. We could talk for a long time about this. I'd love to do that, but I want to make sure that Michael has plenty of time.
Can I hop in real quick before we move on? Because I want to especially commend Curtis on the work that he's done with his municipal partners to document sanitary sewer overflows and building permits in particular. I think a lot of the NEPs do a fine job collaborating with the science entities, and we're in that camp, I think, too. But having this information on the built environment in your State of the Bay is awesome. And I would love to hear more about, your work and getting and gathering that information. And I hope that Yasser checks it out too, and maybe he can help us because he's from the Planning Commission in Hillsborough County, so that we could replicate some of the work that you're doing up in Casco down here in Tampa Bay. I know that's not you.
Aren't you nice? I inherited a State of the Bay framework that started out looking up watershed. And so we've built these relationships over decades. As you do working with the science community, you build the relationships over time. I get a monthly email from the city of Portland listing all of their combined sewer overflow discharges for the month and the rainfall measured at 3 locations around the city. And why? Because they know we care and they know we're going to use their data. When they submit their data to the state regulatory agencies that oversee the combined sewer overflows, I get a copy of the data too. That's building it over time. It's not a newbie. It's been going on for a long time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Curtis. Now we have Michael giving his presentation. I invited Michael because, as he'll tell you very shortly, he's done some really amazing work developing what is now actually an international community of practice around open science, done in the pandemic, no less, which is just blows my mind every time I think about it. So go ahead, Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Marcus. And when I've got my slides up, I can't see everybody else. So if there's a reason, please unmute and interrupt me. Totally fine. And thank you so much once again. And Curtis, I'll try to dovetail on as many of your topics as I can, because I see there's a lot of synergies between us. Just to quickly reintroduce myself, my name is Michael Meyer. I use he, him pronouns. I am a Mendenhall Fellow and Research Geographer at the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm really excited to talk about how we kind of grew a data science and open science community for the aquatic sciences during a global pandemic. But I think it's important to however, I think it's important to contextualize what we as a community globally have been through. So I want to do a year in review of 2020 and 2021. Well, we started with this global COVID-19 pandemic that virtually or essentially uprooted life as we knew it, right? We were forced from in-person interactions, both professionally and personally, into more social isolations. And we really lost a lot of our communities that we relied upon for personal, professional, emotional, mental support. And it was just a really hard, uncertain time for us to be living in, and arguably still are. And with this COVID-19 pandemic, the economic market the economy became pretty uncertain, as we saw with unemployment rates in the U.S. Just skyrocketing during the beginning, at least, of the COVID-19 pandemic. And many folks like myself, who were just entering the job market during this time, became increasingly stressed and increasingly nervous of what job prospects might look like for the next 2, 3, 5 years. So not only did we have to deal with a COVID-19 pandemic, but also an uncertain job market. And while not exclusive to 2020 or 2021's by 2021 by any means, systemic inequalities and quite frankly racist inequalities in society were glaringly apparent. And the COVID-19 pandemic, on top of the uncertain or volatile economic situation, enhanced, if not exacerbated, many of these systemic inequalities in our society that disproportionately affected certain groups and identities, such as Black, Indigenous people of color, Asian Pacific Islanders, the LGBTQ plus community, as well as individuals with intersecting identities, such as Black trans women. So this year in review is just a long walk for the short drink of saying it's been a really hard time to be a person for the past 2.5 years. And for many of us engaged in the scientific community, it's been a hard time to be a researcher. Here I have some screenshots of articles basically just focusing on graduate students in the US or early career folks in the US, or I'm sorry, worldwide, actually, showing that signs of depression and anxiety skyrocketed as mental health deteriorated. And, at least drawing anecdotally from my my time when I was in my PhD, many of the stories that we would talk about among graduate students is, we don't know what the job market's going to be like. Will funding keep going during the pandemic? For folks that were more lab-based or field-based, how could they make up time for all those lost field seasons or experiments and still finish on time? So not only was it a hard time to be a person, is it a hard time to be a person actually during this time, it's also a hard time to be a researcher and fully engaged in the sciences. Now, I'm not somebody that should be offering any solutions to any of the things that I just talked about. However, I think that I'm a pretty optimistic person, and I do have hope for how we can maybe edge towards a path forward. And I'd like to at least share that hope with you. And that hope is I do feel stems from this, pandemic experience as a time for open science to really shine. And a lot of that stems from things that Curtis was just talking about, where we live in a time where there's more publicly available environmental data than ever before. But working with these data and effectively merging these data to tell the types of data narratives that we want at previously unprecedented spatial and temporal scales is a skill set in and of itself. And this largely stems from, as I'm sure many of you folks are aware, that, the data revolution, we're working with data that come in at different frequencies or have different velocities. They might have different types of data or the variety of variables collected. And some of these file sizes can be huge, like genomics data, climate data, CO2 data, and we ultimately want to merge those with other data sources to tell these sort of syntheses. So that's a challenge, right? How do we actually operationalize this? Well, the good news about that is that that's a skill, and a skill can be learned. The thing that we can't do is make the data exist. But fortunately, we live at a time when these data are quite literally at our fingertips. Places like the Environmental Data Initiative, Dryad, Zenodo, Data One, Open Science Framework are those sorts of repositories that I was talking about that you can freely access data quite literally at your fingertips. In addition to agencies such as USGS, NASA, NOAA, the European Space Agency, being more data providers and more high quality platinum level data. And even crowdsourcing initiatives like iNaturalist allow for community science to play a role in this really exciting time in the environmental sciences. But as I said, the challenge, so we've checked that box of are the data available? That's the one thing we need. The second thing we need are the actual skill developments. And as Curtis was alluding to, that can be hard, right? Because we're trying to keep up on all of the advances, in the aquatic sciences, say, and open science and data science practices are their own fields that are developing just as quickly, if not faster than the aquatic sciences. And so it can be really hard, and you can feel stretched thin, having to keep track of advances in both of these disciplines. And that's where I tend to think of open science being inherently about community building, where it's in these communities, or that thing that we haven't experienced for like the past 2.5 years, where we can gather folks who work in the open science, data science, aquatic science space and have these sort of joint conversations to not only show what everyone's doing, but also inspire others that might not be as active in this space. And kind of giving a plug to that JASM session that Marcus talked about, that's a great example. And this group actually is also a great example of how these communities exist. So here I have a word cloud from all of the abstracts contributed at the JASM session. And you know, those big themes pop up like open science, data set, but also more discipline specific words also appear, like oceans, groundwater, monitoring, watershed. And, you know, just a quick plug to those speakers in the session. You know, Marcus has a talk about Tampa Bay Estuary program. Wes Slaughter will be talking about macro sheds and how we can harmonize different river data sets for macro scale analyses. Edgar Gueron Orejuela will be talking about groundwater, or has a poster about groundwater monitoring in Alaska. Carly Hansen talks about synthesizing reservoir data sets to inform hydropower management. And Anna Holder is that second keynote, who will be talking about operationalizing not only open science, but equity in order to advance California's state surface water monitoring program. But the thing is that, like, you know, kind of similar to this group, I guess, but also this conference session, is that those communities can be maybe more temporally fixed to a given time, right? To the confines of these meetings. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is how do we make these communities that are active throughout the year, that it's not fixed to a certain meeting, and also empowers folks with the skills to engage in this science. And that's where I want to talk about two organizations that I've been pretty closely involved with: the Aquatic Ecosystem Modeling Network Junior, or AMON-J, as well as the Community for Incorporating Data Science and Open Science in the Aquatic Sciences, or DSOS. And, you know, just the boilerplate for both of these are two kind of organizations that are joined at the hip, that are meant to not only share exciting science that are going on in this space, but also offer training, and specifically training at the intermediate level to really bring more beginning and novice users who are working in this space to a higher level and really get into those cutting edge techniques. But to give a quick history of how these organizations started, and this is where I need to be careful because I can keep going on about this. It started with my good friend Jake Zwart and I in 2020, when we noticed all of these conferences being postponed or canceled. And we are early career researchers who were on the job market during this time. And we kind of just said, well, everything's getting canceled. We need to get our science out there in a situation that's pretty similar to a conference. Let's see if we can do this virtually. And so we gathered a bunch of speakers who worked in this space to contribute pre-recorded talks. And we organized the virtual summit for data science and open science in aquatic research over 2 days. And admittedly, we thought, how many people will actually register? Like 30, 40, you know, like my mom, my dad, his mom, his dad, okay. But actually 436 people registered. And 275 of those 436 registered in the first 48 hours of us tweeting about it. And it became pretty clear that this science and sharing this science is something that the aquatic science community broadly is really hungry for. And we might have tapped into something that wasn't being I'm trying to think of a word that's not exploited, that wasn't being tapped yet in this community. And what we did was, we thought that we had found something special, and we put up an L&O Bulletin piece that's a meeting highlight that basically talked about, what worked, what didn't work, what could we do better. And in particular, one of the things that we noted of what we could do better was the talks were fantastic, like wonderful, wonderful talks. The diversity and representation of speakers, however, was quite frankly unremarkable, if not abysmal. And we knew that if we wanted to increase representation in this space, we needed help, effectively. We needed help. And so we expanded the organizational org team to include Carol Barbosa, Robert Lodvig, Bella Olexe, and Ali Kramer. All of us, by the way, are early career researchers, postdocs, and PhD students, to help us expand and reach out to new people who could contribute talks and also be on panels for doing this summit again in 2021. But then another theme that we knew was that a lot of folks came to the summit in 2020 and said, I really like this science, this is exciting, but how do I do it? Like, how do I actually write the code to make a process-guided deep learning model? Or like, how do I actually access remote sensing reflectance and perform atmospheric corrections in a cloud environment? And so what we did is we teamed up with Amon J to create the combined DSOS Amon J Hacking Limnology Workshop Series and Summit in 2021. And by the way, so Patricia Tran, Jorrit Messman, Johannes Feldbauer are mainly from Amon J. And we created this workshop and summit. And just like the 2020 summit, we had wide attendance, or registration at least, where 686 people registered from over 50 countries and 6 continents. And 40% of registrants were from the US, 20% were from Nigeria, about 5-6% were from Germany, 5% were from Brazil, and 5% were from Canada. Once again, this just reconfirmed to us that this is something that the community is hungry for. And it's these training sessions, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. The training sessions were focused on remote sensing, working with big data structures, machine learning, and also how to make process-based ecological models. And we documented all of this once again in the L&O Bulletin, in an L&O Bulletin piece, just walking through our experience. So this year, you might be curious, keeping with this theme, once again, we expanded the organizational team to include Sonar Barexi, Rachel Pilla, and Kaylin Colley, just trying to keep increasing the representation of our community and also expanding to new folks. And I'm happy to say that the 2022 Summit and Workshop will be taking place July 25th to 29th. It's free. The slides are available in the Google Drive folder, so you can access registration via the QR code. And so, briefly, Marcus has asked me, how did we do it? And to be quite honest, I'm not 100% sure. But I think if we had to distill it to a few main key points, it's really creating opportunities for folks to feel comfortable and freely participate in this community, highlight and promote early career researchers, empower others with skills and opportunities to participate, create a central hub for material archives, and then keep assessing that we're doing points 1 to 4 through the best of our abilities. And just so I can highlight some of, give these a little bit more structure to how we actually did some of these. Sort of a baseline thing to making folks feel comfortable, and I think it's pretty ubiquitous within the open science community, is have a code of conduct. And it seems one of those things that we always take for granted, but explicitly posting this on the website and also starting each day of an organized event by iterating the code of conduct actually does a nice job of setting a tone, right? And it's intimidating for early career folks like myself to be telling a bunch of more senior folks, hey, the rules of this community are use welcoming language, be respectful, gracefully accept constructive criticism, and if you are found in violation of the code of conduct, we will remove you from the meeting. But the thing is that if the org team doesn't set that tone, no one else will, you know? So that's one of like those low-hanging fruits that we knew we had to do. And then we also thought about how we can encourage more participation. And one of the ways that's really gotten great feedback are these sort of Q&A forums that we do. So for the virtual summit, the way that it works is that we play those pre-recorded talks within a given session sequentially. And while those talks are playing, all of the attendees have access to this Q&A form, which you see on the left. And they can submit questions to a particular presenter or all presenters. And then during the live Q&A session, while the talks are playing, the presenters have access to the response document, which you see on the right, and they're able to think about how they can respond to those questions, you know, so that they're not like on the spot at the end. And this especially helped for a few reasons. As the attendees and for the presenters, actually, we noticed that early career researchers tended to ask more questions in asking some folks why, they were like, well, I sometimes feel uncomfortable going to a conference and asking a question in front of more senior colleagues. And that was number one. And then number two, non-native English speakers started asking more questions because they voiced similar things of like, number one, I feel uncomfortable of like my accent or how I'm phrasing something if I were to unmute and audibly say it or orally say it. And number two, putting it in a written form allows me to edit my question before I submit it. So we noticed more engagement that way. And then another thing we did, keeping with that theme of engaging non-native English speakers in this space, all talks are subtitled, number one. But here's one of the things that I think we did that I really love. In 2021, because talks are subtitled, they don't need to be in English, which can often present a secondary barrier to many folks attending live conferences, right? You know, not only do you have the stress of preparing a scientific talk, but also preparing a scientific talk in your non-native language. And so last year we had a talk in Portuguese, contributed from Rafael Cavalcanti in Brazil. And, you know, we just let folks know that this talk will be streamed in Portuguese, but there's English subtitles. And ultimately what that led to, that was joined with was, you know, we created language channels within our Slack workspace that basically created a home for non-native English speakers to engage in this science in their native language. Or they could ask questions, they can network, and currently we have a few language channels already: Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, German, Russian, Turkish, French, Mandarin, Italian, Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin. And you'll notice that there's Twitter handles next to each of those people, or next to those languages. Those Twitter handles are for the folks who are the moderators of those language channels, who make sure that the code of conduct is still upheld in the language channels. And basically all of this contributed to like how we are able to, I think, maintain that global participation, where each of these language channels is ultimately responsible for can volunteer to produce advertising materials in that language and find networks within those groups. Next, the other ones will go much shorter. That was the longest one. How do we highlight and promote early career researchers? The simplest way is most of the presenters are early career. About 80% of talks contributed are now early career researchers. And also to facilitate networking opportunities, we created a virtual jobs board where basically, you know, I like to say it's like wearing a ribbon at a conference on your name tag that's like, I'm looking for a job or I'm hiring a postdoc. Where you can add your name, your contact information, and a few websites or virtual portfolios that you have online. And I do know of at least, I'm not going to assign a number, but several folks have found jobs and found employees through this virtual jobs board already. It's really exciting to see. Okay, empower others with the skills. So this is ultimately the job of the workshops. And there's 4 main components. So basically the way it works is that each day of the workshop has a theme. So this year we have themes in remote sensing, data science, and aquatic ecosystem modeling. So at each day has 4 main components. One, there's an introductory talk that's pre-recorded and available for viewing about a week prior to the workshop. And what that intro talk is meant to do is to help those more beginning or novice learners that need to know like the key vocabulary and the key concepts to engage in that day. Then there's a keynote talk that each day opens with a keynote talk that's more of like that shoot for the stars type thing, to show you what's possible with that technique. But the meat of that day is a hands-on coding workshop, and it's live. So here I have a screenshot of when Xiaoyang and Simon Top gave a 2-hour demonstration in getting up with Google Earth Engine. And the way that I tell the way that I communicate to the workshop leaders how they should design each day is basically everyone should walk away with a product. So like a pretty figure that they can print out, hang on their fridge, right? Like Michael, age 30, and be proud of. So like what Xiao did was he used Landsat temperature data. And what we were able to do was create a 60 meter pixel raster for the entire United States from 1990 to 2020 of the average temperature within each of those pixels. And they were able to make a GIF that iterated through. And then Simon, he provided a derived data product of Landsat reflectance values for 50,000 lakes throughout the continental US. And folks were allowed to folks could look at change in lake color through time. But lastly, another key part of these days are the brainstorming hour, where folks can interact with the workshop leaders. Ideally, there's brainstorming groups where folks can talk about developing new projects or products from the day. And then there's also just a social room where folks can meet other people who are interested in this space and just build their social network. Creating a central hub. So ultimately, we knew that we wanted to archive this somehow, and we wanted to stick to our roots in the open science world. So we created an open science framework project, which basically houses or serves as an archive for all of the talks and all of the workshop materials that have been contributed to the workshop. And you can download those and go through each of them. There's subtitles that are subtitle files for everything that we have. And basically, this serves 2 main purposes. One, it allows the folks who are contributing to the community to get some product out of it. Like Marcus gave a talk at the 2020 summit, and at least a workshop or a presenter now gets something that's citable from this. And then from a community perspective, it allows folks that are just learning about the community to go back to previous materials and learn more and access all of those contributions, even if they're just learning about the 2022 summit. And so step 5, continuously reassess. I think a lot of this just has to deal with the org team holding each other accountable. Every meeting we have, we try to really grill and dig down into, are we creating a diverse space? Are we reaching out to underrepresented communities? And are we doing our best to create opportunities for engagement? And that involves having very serious, frank discussions about like, what are we going to do if we have a speaker list that doesn't meet our criteria that we set for ourselves? And these are still like ongoing discussions. I'm not going to say like we have everything figured out by any means. But I think that one of the main ways that we were able to expand so much so quickly is having these sorts of discussions and actively working on these points. And also keeping in mind, there's always the things that like we can change overnight and the things that require long-term change. And one thing that we do say during the summit and the workshops is we always say, if indeed there is something that we can change overnight, we will do it. And sometimes that happens. But, I think ultimately just having those frank conversations are really important in this space. So just to sum up, the 5 things that I kind of took away or that I was able to distill, but ultimately, if I had to add a 6th, it's the only reason that we're able to do this summit and workshops is because of the hard work and the willingness to share their science from the presenters, the panelists, and ultimately for the participants that want to engage in this space. And ultimately, from a personal perspective, I would not be here talking with all of you. I would not be talking at JASM if it wasn't for this amazing organizational team whom I have the privilege to work with. And so kind of summing up, hopefully I didn't take too long, but open science I think is inherently about building communities. This is a time where we've kind of been thrown out of many of our communities. But when I think about what I can do to make the world a little bit better with my science, I think open science is a pathway forward by inherently making these open, inclusive spaces. Sorry I took way too long. Hopefully that was okay.
Thank you so much, Michael. You always set the bar way, way high for open science, and it's really exciting and motivating to hear about the great work you've done over the last couple of years. So one of the reasons I invited you to talk to this group is because you've had great success of developing your community at an international scale, as you just explained. But our group here in Tampa Bay, we were trying to do the same things, but on a local scale. I actually was going to ask you a question relevant to that, but before I do that, I'll let other people chime in if they have some questions for you before I prattle on about what I'm interested in.
I'll jump in if everybody else is being quiet. Michael did it to me, so I'll do it to him. Especially when you were talking about presentations coming in different languages getting subtitled. Maybe I've been a director too long, but my head immediately went to budgets. How do you get this stuff done? How do you keep things rolling? It's very easy to say I can fix something overnight as long as you've got a budget to move it forward or you've got volunteers to move it forward, but you need those resources. So can you talk a little bit about, sort of where the juices come from and how you've been able to keep that going?
So with respect to the subtitles, YouTube does it for free. Even in different languages, it'll generate subtitles. So what we request is that if you're contributing a non-English talk, we will find either the person contributing it, or we will find somebody to take the YouTube generated subtitles for the native language and English and just be sure that they match. So at least the bulk of it is on YouTube. And then you can still download those subtitles files from YouTube. And all of the software that we use for everything in the summit is all open source as well. I had to draw the line at making markdown slides, but because that was just a little too time consuming. But that's the thing. But that's the things that we think about, right? When Google Slides and PowerPoint slides weren't necessarily accommodating to alt text for figures. We were like, okay, Markdown will let us do it. So let's render these slides in Markdown. So that's number 2. So with respect to funding, that ultimately, something I didn't say now because I knew I was running short on time was the org team tries to keep in mind that we are highly privileged in that we all have flexible funding sources. So really the only real cost is our time. And we luckily have a team that, not saying this is the way it should be. It's 9 to 5 is our job and 5 to 9 is the things that we want to do. So luckily we have a team that is willing to do the 5 to 9. Because literally, what we do is go through each of the YouTube generated subtitles and correct where commas should be and periods should be and misspellings. Yeah,
Thanks.
hopefully I answered your question. Sure, of course.
Oh yeah. I like I said, maybe I've just been a director too long, but I'm always falling back to how do you put it together? A lot of lessons of what you presented that I think are applicable for our local work. I mean, we think of ourselves as an estuary partnership as we do a lot of similar things, but we're not using a lot of the tools you're using. So there's maybe some lessons for going from this global scale to what do we do locally, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have questions for Michael? We need one of those Google Forms that you showed, Michael. That's my take home from this.
Yeah. And then I saw like AGU doing something similar this year, and I'm like, we thought of that so long ago.
They stole your ideas.
They did.
Anyway, so the question I wanted to ask you is, one of your guidelines for developing the community of practice, and all of them were fantastic. But the one that I think resonated to our particular community here is the history of the Estuary program in Tampa is one built on partnerships, like any successful organization, and it goes back several decades. And a situation we're in now is many of the folks that were instrumental in those first partnerships are retiring. Yet there's still, several mid-career folks, a lot of early career folks that are now sort of understanding the history of our program and the community that we developed to make Tampa Bay what it is today. But we're struggling with that translation from the old guard to the new guard, and not just understanding the context and the history of the program, but how open science can be a part of that narrative. We actually have open science as part of our strategic goals for bringing science to the community and decision makers. So targeting early career professionals is something we're trying to do, and I really appreciate that. But what do you do for the folks that are either, they're not going to retire? I mean, everyone's going to retire eventually, but there's also mid-career folks that are maybe really hesitant to adopt these new ideas, these new tools. It's easier to target new early career professionals, but how do you get that subset of the people you're working with that are entrenched in a sense to pick up these ideas? Is it a lost cause, or are there different strategies you might want to use?
Yeah, that's
not
tough.
an easy question. I'm sorry.
No. I can at least tell you my thoughts. There's a few different things that I'm thinking of, and I know I'll forget them as I'm saying them. The big thing, I get a question. The question I get a lot is from like early career people that are like, I really want to write my code, I want to publish my data, but my advisor or my boss wants me to do a classical publication. And I'm like, in my perspective, it's always reframing, for those folks that like haven't bought in yet. It's let's say instead of like a publication, it's really a product, right? Like everything is still citable. It generates a DOI. And I have noticed a fair amount of success with that. You're really making a portfolio. And another thing that I was thinking of is like, how do you, recognizing, how do you get new buy-in, but also, keep folks active in the community, I guess is one way to say it. And so I think there's many different philosophies for how you can do that. One way, this is not inclusive to my talk, but I think the early career folks, I think, are pretty cognizant of the fact, like, you stand on the shoulders of giants, right? That's the theme of open science, right? And so I think by saying, number one, like being inclusive to middle career, late career, emeritus folks, it's not, even if they're not as involved, like you're still able to do what you do because they laid foundations. Full stop, carriage return. But the next thing is also like just setting clear guidelines for like what that means, right? Like, we've all seen that one senior researcher who like collected data in 1950, and those data are being used, and they're like, well, I should be on the authorship line. And that happens. I think the way to do that is, the way that I've had success doing that is just make an authorship contract and like just lay it out and say, these are the rules that the community is going with. Do you agree? So like all of my projects have an authorship contract. And that's really taken care of a lot of things. There was another thing that I was going to say, but I totally forgot what it was. Yeah.
Well, I mean, good points. You know, the other take home I'm getting away from this. Go ahead.
I remember, sorry. I remember the last thing. You know, something that I've done for my own work is also, as an early career person, right, who's adopting these things, I have to assume that all of my collaborators are just as good, if not better than I am at these skills, right? So like if I'm using GitHub and I add a more like a mid-career person, I like have to assume that they're just as good, if not better. And that's a bad assumption a lot of the time. So what I often do is like, I mean, and I can share this workflow, right? But like how I had that open science framework, I love OSF because like you can plug in GitHub into it and like basically everything's accessible in one space, but it's in a more like point and clicky environment. But like, I guess, and it's got version control, but the main takeaway that I'm thinking of, I think it's important for folks who are adopting these things or these techniques. It's like, how do I move this open science forward, but not exclude participation of other researchers who might not be as technically savvy as I. And like, there's not a great example, or there's not a great answer for that, but like, it's something to at least think about.
Yeah, and that's another good point too. Is what I've found with GitHub, for example. That's our go-to platform we use for archiving, which even though it's not a formal archival service, there's ways to use that with individuals that aren't necessarily aware of really what version control is or using the command line to access it. And that's something that I'm trying to impress on folks, is that GitHub is a tool for everybody. But
Yes.
the Open Science Framework initiative is, you know, tying that into GitHub. That's a new thing that I want to explore now, as another way to really, I think, expand the ability of other folks to just engage with the products in a way that they haven't before. So a question from Mike McManus. Can you share your example of an authorship contract?
Sure.
Not right this second, but we can get it.
Yeah, I can do that.
Your people will talk to my people.
Great.
So we do have to wrap up. I want to thank you, Michael, and of course Curtis as well, for providing some really engaging talks today. I think this have been one of the best meetings we've had so far to date. And I also have to apologize to Greg Blanchard. We were going to have a discussion about this concept called no-code, low-code app development that we can save for the next time. And I think that discussion is relevant to some of the things that we've talked about today, with engaging people with different skill sets, or the moving bar of what it means to develop open science tools. So we'll save that for next time. I guess if you have any remaining questions for any of the speakers, you can contact them individually if that's okay. I don't know if you guys want to share your emails in the chat. I believe they should have your contacts in the presentations as well that are linked on our agenda. But our next meeting will be, hold on, let me pull up my slides. Our next meeting is August 2nd. So I'll be looking for speakers for that meeting as well. And I also want to put out a feeler for an open science training that I would like to do locally. Chris Anastasio and I gave an open science training at SURF the end of last year, and we were going to do that at BASIS. That was last month, but because of my paternity leave, I had to cancel that. So we're trying to do that again later this year, perhaps, and I'm just putting that announcement out there as maybe something to look forward to as its own separate event. So with that, thank you all for your time. Thanks again to my speakers, and we'll see you next time.